I want to ask you something about reforms for Islam. Does Islam need reform?
It needs a renaissance. It doesn't need a reform. Reform in the sense, and the reason I say that is because we have to be careful of our terminology. If we say reform as in Reformation, we're thinking of a Christian context, where you had the Protestants and Martin Luther saying, rejecting the Catholicism and the Pope. But the thing is, in Islam, there is no Pope. There is no centralized authority. So there can't be a reformation in that sense. What there needs to be is a return to genuine Islamic principles, which have been not studied, have not been enforced, and forgotten. So it's not exactly that.
All right.
But a return to genuine Islamic principles is exactly what Al-Qaeda is advocating.
No, that's not actually what they're... No, that's actually incorrect.
A return, a rebirth,
Al-Qaeda, so the difference between Al-Qaeda
is exactly what all those extremist organizations
are. The radio cannot make sense of two voices, and I'm talking now too at the same time. So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to make that point, and then I want to hear back. So think 20 seconds.
When you look at the extremist the organizations that we've come to call extremist, what they're advocating when they answer the question, what went wrong? We had this empire, we lost it. How do we regain it? Their answer is a rebirth. Let's go back to the origins, a revival of it. Is that what you want, Ziba?
No, they actually covert the language for their own political purposes. Al-Qaeda is not calling for a return to Islam or to original Islam or anything like that. They're actually using Islam as a cover for their political grievances. When you look and ask Muslims, ask 1.5 billion Muslims, when you look at the mainstream, they're 90%. They're peaceful and fine. When you look at the politically radicalized, when you ask them, what do they fear most? They say Western domination and occupation. But when you ask mainstream Muslims what they fear, they say economic issues, unemployment. There's a clear difference. And so they're not, what we can determine from that is that it's not religion, because religiosity between the two is indistinguishable. How pious they are, indistinguishable. It's the one factor that makes the difference is what they focus on and their grievances against, perceived grievances against the West.
But don't we get back to one of the core problems which you still haven't addressed, which is the life of Muhammad and his teachings, which is as follows. Is that if a Christian group decides to go back to the teachings of Christ, you know, the worst stuff they find is the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. They can find one verse where Jesus is said, I think the Gospel of St. Matthew, to have said, I come not to bring peace but a sword. But the rest of it is all love thy neighbour and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Christian group looking to go back to the sources of Christianity, you just find a lot of, well, hippie stuff for a lot of modern people. So what is it about this religion we're talking about tonight that you say is a religion of peace, that when people go back to the origins, they find a founder who was violent, teaching violence?
See, this comes back to what you mean by people going back to the origins, and I refuse, as does Zeba, and as we're asking for all of you to do, is to refuse for Islam to be hijacked and monopolized by the bin Ladens of this world who want to tell you what it means to go back to the original sources. Now, if that was the case, then I ask you, why is it that in Bangladesh, where there was a free and fair election, the Islamist party lost roundly? They completely lost the elections. In Pakistan, where there were recent elections, the Islamist alliance in the north that came to prominence after the occupation of Afghanistan, they completely lost all their seats. So the Muslims in two of the most populous Muslim-majority countries in the world, as is the case in Indonesia, whenever they have a chance to vote, they do not vote for the Islamist extremists. And time again in elections across Muslim-majority states, they have proven that their interpretation of Islam, and they are the majority, is not the interpretation of Douglas, Ayaan and bin Laden. Now, I don't want to be in that camp.
All right. I want to take a little break and move on to the topic and the status of women in Islam. I'm John Donvan of ABC News. This is an Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. We're at the Skirball Center for the Performing Arts in New York City. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace. We have two teams of two arguing for the motion, Zeba Khan and Majid Nawaz, and arguing against the motion, Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Douglas Murray. Here in the West, one of the issues that is very complicated for people in coming to terms with what they think Islam is the status of women in Islam. I'd like to go to Zeba Khan. Take that on. You know what I'm talking about.
The perception is that for a lot of people out looking at the Muslim world and Muslim majority countries is that Muslim women are somehow they aren't, they're subjugated, that they don't, to a point where they are intimidated to ask for their rights and to demand them. But that's not the case. I mean, when you look across Muslim majority countries, if you look at Iran, for example, where there's zero gender gap in education, by the way, men and women enjoy the same amount of education. Obviously, when you're at that level of education, you're aware of what your rights are and what you are demanding. And so, you know, in Iran and places like that, they are demanding their rights. They are pushing for them. In places like Afghanistan or Pakistan, where the gender gap is larger, that gap obviously needs to be filled. But there are women who are pushing there as well. It's not. It's women that are stepping up and taking the lead on this.
Other side response? Ayaan, Hirsi.
Well, when I try to define Islam as a religion, there is expression. What you find in the Quran is expression after expression, verse after verse, and also in the Hadith, that women are subordinate to men, that they have a guardian, they need to have a guardian, their testimony is worth half of that of men, they can only inherit half of what their brother inherits. When it comes to sexual offenses, women are the ones who get, in reality, where Sharia is implemented, and that is not only the practical side of Islam, but also the fellowship side of Islam, everywhere where Sharia is implemented. And there are more places in the world today where Sharia as a family law is implemented, and where it's not implemented on a political level, but in all of those places you see a subjugation of women. You see honor killings. You see women who are denied education. If you look on a global level, the levels of illiteracy among women in the Middle East is appalling. That's not something that I'm telling you because I'm, you know, whatever, I misunderstand Islam, but that is report after report. And the latest one is the United Nations UNDP Human Development Report that was first published in 2002, and that was again published in 2003, 2004. And if you follow these reports, this is empirics. This is not something that I'm imagining. The situation of women in the Middle East, in Muslim countries, is dire. And the principles that underlie it and the practices are Islamic. It's Sharia law in action. And the appalling, the nightmare is women who have fled those countries, who are now in the West, American citizens, European citizens, are subjected to parts of Sharia law. And Ziba, I think that denying that, kind of, not just as a matter of debate, but I then try to question, where does your solidarity lie as a woman who grew up in a free country, a free woman, and as vocal as you are, shouldn't you be more solidar with them?
I am. I am. But I absolutely am, and as all women should be, and actually all human beings should, to demand the rights of equality. In fact, most Muslims want equal rights for the women in their societies. And if it goes to, just go to the research, go to the polls, go to the research on what it says. When you ask men, should women have equal rights? Majority in the countries surveyed, in the Gallup survey, said yes, they should have equal rights, including in Saudi Arabia.
I want to acknowledge that a lot more needs to be done and a lot more needs to be said about eliminating some of the practices that you referred to, Ayaan. And I recognize that there are practices in Muslim-majority societies across the world that are repugnant, not just to a Western mind, but generally to any decent, rational human being. But I want to approach this being a man, and the first man on the panel to comment on this question. Great. I want to approach this from a slightly different angle, and that is this, that many of you in the audience are men, and if the law of average was to fall true, then you'd be probably around 50%. Now, how many of you would be comfortable with your spouse, your wife, as your boss at the same time? And it may sound, it may actually be a truism, because for many people in a marriage, the boss is the wife. But the reason I'm asking that question is that even in times like today, many men find that uncomfortable to be married to their boss. And yet, Ayaan, who referred to these practices that were repugnant to us and said that they are sourced in Islam, the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, his boss, his first wife, was his boss. And many people don't know that. And so what I want to demonstrate by this point is that it's a complex matter. There are practices in Muslim-majority societies that we need to reform, but it's too simplistic to trace them back to the life of a man who lived 1400 years ago, and in many of his practices was quite revolutionary for his time, and in others was like every other man during his time. So the fact that Douglas referred to the fact that he had a bride that was underage is something which we can now look back on and say that was an awful practice. But just as we look back on many things that Romans did and say that was an awful practice, just as we look back on many things that Martin Luther did and said that was an awful practice. But we don't judge these men by the standards that we have today.
Let's bring in Douglas Murray.
No, we do, and we should. We should, Majid. And may I say, it's a bit too cutesy to compare a man who raped a 9-year-old girl repeatedly with men being, the wife's a bit of the master of the household and so on. A bit too cutesy and a bit too much avoiding the issue, which is this. And this is actually a very real concern, which doesn't just apply in mid-7th century Arabia, but today, here and now, in Britain. In my own country, we now have, thanks to to an arbitration act put into law in the 1990s, whereby people can have civil disputes arbitrated under laws that they can decide on, that we now have Sharia courts in Great Britain. And the Sharia courts that in Great Britain are operated by people who are actually clerics. They are religious authorities. There's one at the moment, Siddiqui in Leicestershire. Now this man runs a set of Sharia courts. A couple of years ago, it turned out that we found out a little bit about the sort of thing he was deciding. And sadly, again, it's not reformist stuff, because when you go back to the Sharia, people take the lessons from it and they make judgments like the following: 6 women who had gone to the Sharia courts because they were being physically abused by their husbands. They were persuaded to drop the cases because this should be a matter between a Muslim woman and her Muslim husband and the Sharia court. This should not be a matter for the police in Great Britain in 2008. That stinks. What's more, there was in another case, a local Muslim man died. His will was arbitrated by Sharia because that was what happens now in 21st century Britain. And the arbitration of this man's will gave half the inheritance to the daughters as to the sons of the man, because that's what you have in the Quran.
But
so it's all very well to say
just
that it's
actually
something
said that he agrees with you that this stuff needs to change.
Yeah, but the point is that when you look at the courts that are doing this, when you look at the religious authorities, when you look at the clerics, the judgments they're making, those are the kinds of judgments. I wish that Majid would get some clerics on his side who could set up rival Sharia courts that didn't decide that women were second-class citizens. But sadly, at the moment, that is the case.
So, Douglas, actually, the irony was, that, as you know well, that the person who came out most publicly in support of those regrettable Sharia courts in the UK was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we at Quilliam opposed their creation. And actually many Muslims in Britain do oppose their creation because it raises the question. Islam has never had a clergy, it's never had a pope, and so when you try and institute Sharia courts as law, the question arises, whose Sharia do you follow? Now that's an internal debate that's going on and raging, and that I'm part of in Pakistan, for example, because there isn't one version of Sharia, and everything you've referred to is bad. We condemn these practices, but the fact is we can't be reductionist, essentialist, simplistic, lack nuance and call it Sharia, because there isn't one Sharia, as you well know, just as there isn't one reading of Shakespeare.
All right, I want to move on, and when we come back we're going to take questions from the audience.